Hello everyone, this is Ponder on Weather. In this update, we're going to be talking about some Arctic air moving in as the polar vortex starts to stretch and a potential snowstorm heading into next week. So let's take a look at the overall 500 millibar on the Northern Hemisphere view this morning. You can actually see a pretty cold air mass is already entrenched over portions of New England and off the East Coast here. And it's going to be a chilly rain for them today. And the ridge of high pressure creates that blocking underneath in portions of Canada and British Columbia, where the colder air mass is starting to build in Siberia. But a noticeable difference as we head into this weekend, with that deepening Arctic air really starting to amplify and build over Siberia, you have the blocking underneath that will create the stretching that the polar vortex will start to pull that Arctic air from Siberia through Canada and sending pulses of it, some piece of it and pieces of the into the Ohio Valley, portions of the Northeast, and getting into New England headed into this weekend. So let's take a look at the ensemble member guidance, which is also implying the same thing on the latest GFS guidance, implying that that Arctic air is really starting to build over Siberia, will start to stretch out and sending pulses of that into the United States heading into this weekend. So what exactly is the polar vortex? So right now it's fairly stable. So all that Arctic air is kind of bundled up into Siberia. When it does that, all the colder any Arctic air is really just trying to entrenched up in Siberia and Canada. But once it starts to buckle, once you start to see the kind of the overall polar jet stream start to buckle, that'll start to create kind of a wave in the polar vortex. And there are signs, well, it will start to stretch out going into this weekend. And when that does that, that will start to elongate. It'll start to elongate and send pieces of that colder air mass a little bit further southward. So that's the reason why the latest Climate Prediction Center has literally about a 90% chance probability heading into this weekend that the much of the Ohio Valley, the Northeast, and a good chunk of New England is going to be well below average temperatures, with that ridge of high pressure really dominating over portions of the Northwest. That'll create that blocking that's needed and that funnel effect with the Arctic air mass. So let's take a look at the snowpack. So this is actually going to be fairly significant. So let's take a look at well up north. This is your current snowpack on October 3rd in Siberia. But notice the drastic difference as we head into this weekend going into next Monday over a 7-day time frame. Yeah, that's a fairly significant difference in the snowpack. That'll actually set the stage for our potential snowstorm, as some of this Arctic air will send pieces of it into portions of the United States, setting up our potential snowstorm for next week. But also, this actually might signal a kind of a longer term view. So if this is actually going to be able to continue through October and November, a lot of times that typically signals heavier snowstorms into New England and the Northeast and a much colder winter. So we'll have to see if this is able to continue beyond this week. But this is a fairly significant, this early signal, this early on in the season, that a drastic difference in the overall snowpack in Siberia will really lay the groundwork with what may be to come in for deeper into the winter months. But what's also significant is the EPO, which is your Eastern Pacific Oscillation. This is a fairly significant drop. I mean, right now it's a -2 deviation, and they're already getting some freezing temperatures in the upper Great Lakes and portions of New England this morning. But by the time we get into this weekend, it drops all the way down to a -5 deviation. That is a fairly colder air mass for this time of year. To put it in perspective, if this was January or February, would be a very frigid air mass. But yeah, some colder air is definitely going to be entrenched down from Siberia through Canada and pulling into portions of New England as we head into this weekend. And it actually sticks around for several days heading into early next week. So let's take a look at the overall temperatures this morning for your October 3rd. So even with that negative two deviation on the EPO, we're already seeing some cooler air mass already filtering in that part of the country. And some of these temperatures are actually below freezing this morning in portions of Michigan and portions of the Northeast, headed into portions of Maine, with much of the Northwest, and at least in the higher elevations, are experiencing those cooler conditions. But most of the country is experiencing, at least in the morning time frame, some definitely cooler conditions and a great fall-like weather. So let's take a look at the overall setup for today. So we're still dealing with, this is actually what was Category 4 Orlean down here into the Eastern Pacific. Luckily, this is weakening on the approach and expected to make landfall sometime today in Mexico near Mazatlan as a Category 1 hurricane, but that will actually send pieces of it, kind of the remnants, the kind of the leftover energy in portions of New Mexico, getting into Arizona, and even in the higher elevations, we are going to see some snow flying later on this afternoon in some of the higher elevations, probably above 9,000 feet. But we'll have an upper level low combining. So this area will start to see some isolated to scattered thunderstorm activity. But out here, we're still dealing with the remnants of Ian in parts of the Northeast, where it's just going to be kind of a chilly, raw, cold day in a good chunk of the Northeast with temps in the 50s. Going to be raining. It's just going to be a kind of a raw day and a good chunk of along the East Coast with windy conditions, coastal winds, higher waves along the coast, as this kind of hybrid low is still kind of sitting and spinning. And it stays that way even into tomorrow. So tomorrow really doesn't go anywhere. It just kind of sits and spins and sends in pulses of energy. Kind of, again, another chilly, raw day for a good chunk, especially along the coast here from North Carolina to Virginia to New Jersey, back into New York, getting into, portions of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Nantucket, Boston. Those areas will see that chilly rain as we'll start to see the remnants of Orlean lifting further north into Mexico. Again, spreading that monsoonal flow, combining with the remnants of Orlean going into your Tuesday time frame. And then the same deal on Wednesday. Again, they can't get rid of Ian. It's just kind of the remnants of this hybrid low slowly starts to wind down, but you still could see the effects of it along the coastal regions. And then Orlean will be by then, and we'll start to modify this air mass. We'll start to take a look at the Arctic air mass that's coming from Canada. So by Friday, we start to see a piece of that Arctic air trying to push out from Canada, from Siberia, and pulsing and sending, heading into portions of the upper Great Lakes. So you're going to definitely feel the difference by the time we get into Friday morning at portions of Minnesota, Iowa, getting into Wisconsin, headed into Michigan by then, and that will continue southeastbound as we head into this weekend. And that's going to be definitely by far the coldest temperatures of the season heading into Saturday time frame with that negative deviation of 5 on the EPO. That'll definitely send some very chilly air into portions of the Ohio Valley. That'll start to filter in into upstate New York, getting into Vermont and New Hampshire by then. But let's take a look at the overall wind chills, because you're definitely going to feel this was widespread 20s and lower 30s for feels like temperatures in a good chunk of Minnesota, Wisconsin, heading into Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, a good chunk of the upstate New York, and this will continue to dive down and impact most of the Northeast as we head into this weekend. But let's switch gears going into next week. So let's take you back all the way into the Northern Hemisphere view and take a look at the tropopause. This is what you're looking at. It's about 6 to 10 miles up in the atmosphere. But let me focus on Siberia here. I showed you the significant snowpack that's building from today all throughout the week heading into next Monday. And that's a fairly significant cold Arctic air mass building over Siberia. By the time we get into middle parts of next week, that'll send a piece of that energy southbound, with this upper level low really starting to come to fruition by then. that'll send some very cold air into portions of Idaho and to Montana, and that will continue southeast bound as we head into the middle of next week. So let's take a look at all the layers of the atmosphere a little bit further closer to the surface. This is about 5,000 feet, so underneath that, that's definitely some chilly air. You're going to be feeling it in a big way as temperatures are going to start to plummet in a good chunk of Montana, Idaho, as you're starting to feel the effects of that the building of the snowpack that's in Siberia. But underneath of that, we've got a pretty strong low pressure that's going to be coming out of that region. So we've got a lot of moisture with this system, and we could be looking at, look at the tight isobars. That's indicative, could be very windy at the time frame, but also some snow, if not heavier snow, should start to fly in a good chunk of Idaho into Montana. That'll eventually filter down into portions of Wyoming as we get into the middle of next week, and it'll definitely start to build and push further south into Utah, into Wyoming by then. That filters into portions of getting into Colorado, but it'll also signify maybe a pattern change as we head to the middle part of the month here, as finally that would help open up the Gulf of Mexico and finally maybe bring a pattern change and maybe bring some more rain back in the picture for Texas, back in Oklahoma, and back into Kansas. But again, that won't be probably until the middle of the month time frame. But we've got a fairly significant snow on the table for next week. But yeah, there's the temperatures underneath that by the time we get into middle of next week, with that low pressure center bringing definitely by far the coldest temperatures of the season for British Columbia. These are actual temperatures, folks, and much of Washington and Oregon and to Idaho here into Montana. Widespread 20s, if not teens, and a good chunk of that region with that heavier snow flying, and that colder air continue to dive southeast into Nevada. We're seeing 20s show up there, and much of Wyoming as well. And look at the feels like. I mean, that's some definitely chilly air mass for your second week of October, with widespread teens, if not some of these temperatures in the higher elevations could see your first signs of below freezing. I mean, not below freezing, but below zero. Below zero feels like temperatures as we head into next Thursday, October the 13th, into Montana and a good chunk of Idaho, and that filters into Wyoming as well. So it definitely have much colder air mass on the way. And then underneath that, we could be looking at our first significant snow heading into next week. Most of this doesn't start until Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday time frame for next week for sure, but we could be looking at some heavier snows into portions of southern Canada, back into Montana, and that'll filter into Wyoming and a good chunk of portions of Utah, as well as Colorado. We'll definitely see some heavier snows as we head into next week. So hey, I appreciate you guys watching. Do like this video, definitely hit the subscribe button, and catch the next update where I protect you before and after the storm.